So welcome now to our second episode of Shtick, our webinar series, which discusses the relationship between satire and religion. I'll introduce myself to those who haven't joined us last week. So my name is Alissa Symon. I'm a research assistant at the Woolf Institute, and I'm also a DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford. And the Woolf Institute is located in Cambridge, and it focuses on the connection between faith and society. And we have numerous programs that do this, and you're welcome to look us up on the internet and read more about what we do. With us today, we have Professor James Crossley. Professor Crossley joined St. Mary's University in September 2015 as Professor of Bible, Society, and Politics after 10 years at the University of Sheffield, where he was Professor of Bible, Culture, and Politics. He is also the Academic Director of the Center for the Critical Study of Apocalyptic and Millenarian Movements. His research and teaching focus on Christian origins and Judaism in the first century, modern political receptions of the Bible, and particularly, but not exclusively, in English political discourse. So we begin today's episode where we will be discussing the epic life of Brian, and I rewatched it last night and was just reminded how incredibly successful and interesting this movie is. And I trust that most of our audience has watched this movie or has at least heard about this movie. And like The Jews Are Coming, which we discussed last week, The Life of Brian is a very popular movie which conducts rich dialogue with a religious text and was banned, critiqued, protested against due to some of its blasphemous themes. When the movie was released, some theaters refused to show it. And in general, it generated a lot of discussion about the legitimacy of religious ridicule and irony in the public sphere. So also, again, like the themes which we visited last week. One of the great papers that I came across about the topic was written by Professor Crossley, and I'm very excited to host him on today's webinar. So as usual, we will hear a 10-minute presentation, and then we will open up the floor for questions. From the audience, please write your questions in the Q&A, so that's at the bottom of your screen. If you are watching us on Zoom, and if you're watching us via Facebook Live, then just on the comments, and we will alternate between Zoom and Facebook. If you then have further comments about how we answered your question, you can type them into the comment page on the portal Zoom. And now on to you, Professor Crossley.
Thanks a lot for that, and thanks for all the technical help with all this and showing the video. Appreciate that. This clip is particularly interesting, I think, because for a number of reasons. It shows a couple of the key issues that emerge from Life of Brian. Firstly, one is I think the changing nature of blasphemy or offence. Let's just leave aside sort of official blasphemy laws and things like that, and just think about what blasphemy is, how it's perceived, and what offence is. And typically, this offence and blasphemy is in the eye of the blasphemed or offended. And the reasons this film was offensive at the time to so many people is probably, if it was released today, I don't think it would be in the same way. And I think the reason it would be controversial for different reasons today. And one of them, I think, one of the key ones would be issues to do with gender, sexuality, and things like this. I think, for instance, even that very phrase, being raped at first, used to be kind of, sort of a classic line and all this kind of thing. Now that would be kind of, I suspect, one of the central points of contention if the film were released today. And then there are other scenes in the film of similar kind of contemporary controversy. I think the issue of sex change and things like this in the film would provoke controversy today, rather than the religious stuff. And and this is quite a common recurring theme in the history of blasphemy and offence. 100 years ago, the stuff that would have caused offence, blasphemy, would have been deemed blasphemous. It's pretty tame, and you'd find even conservative Christians saying some of the things that would have been said 100 years ago. So the ideas of blasphemy and offence are always changing. And I think Life of Brian, now we've got a bit of critical distance from when it was released, we can see how some of it is actually, some of the stuff that's deemed to be offensive is probably quite tame, whereas some of the other issues now have emerged in different ways. But there are other things more. I mean, let's try to think of this film in its historical context. 1979, late 80s, when it was late 70s when it was released, and its early receptions. The idea that Brian's mother was raped or not raped, or that he had a Roman father, um, is quite significant in itself, because it's a bit like some of the theories about Jesus, some of the controversial theories about Jesus. There's been, from at least the 2nd century onwards, a polemic, an allegation that Jesus had a Roman father. I mean, it's, I think, almost certainly originated as a polemic against Christianity to discredit Jesus. But nonetheless, it's there, and it resurfaces every now and then in critical scholarship. The other emphasis in that little scene is on Jewishness. I mean, Brian really stresses that he's Jewish, emphatically so. You listen all the kind of nicknames and things. Again, something that was very much in vogue in the 1970s when it comes to discussing who Jesus was, the historical Jesus. That is the Jesus of history behind the gospel text, the ones that historians might reconstruct. Geza Vermesh's book, Jesus the Jew, was published in 1973 and was initially quite controversial, but settles into becoming quite a mainstream view pretty quickly. The idea that Jesus was Jewish, fairly tame suggestion these days, you know, it doesn't really matter, of course he was. But in the 1970s, this is still this was still something that could be seen as, and was actually seen as, potentially blasphemous. Gates, one review of Vermesh's book called it blasphemous, in fact. Now, what you'll notice here is that I'm kind of almost assuming that Brian is Jesus. Now, is he? Well, I think it's a sort of yes and no question. Obviously, on one level, there are two different characters in the film. There is the kind of cinematic Jesus, the Jesus of popular faith, who gives the Sermon on the Mount, who does everything that's attributed to him, he heals lepers or whatever. And then there's Brian, who runs alongside him as a kind of parallel. So they are sort of kept apart as two distinct characters, but also they are clearly parallel characters. They're born in the same place. They die the same kind of way. They've got similar names: Jesus of Nazareth, Brian of Nazareth, and so on and so forth. There's clearly some kind of parallel going on. And I think, and I've argued that Brian is a kind of cipher, a way of talking about what scholars say about the historical Jesus, in distinction from that kind of Christ of faith. Now, I think there's good evidence for this in the film. I think there's good evidence outside the film. The writers themselves were very clear that they had used critical scholarship in trying to do this film. They said they didn't want it just to be a series of silly gags. They wanted it to be have some kind of intellectual comment on religion, and including 1st century religion. So I don't think these themes of Jewishness and the alleged parentage are coincidentally, I think they're quite deliberately done to parallel what's going on in historical Jesus scholarship. Now, if you look at other parts of the film, this is also quite a sustained theme. I mean, one of the most famous scenes when he goes out into the desert, the naked guy's there, and everyone starts proclaiming he's the Messiah, his divinity, and all this, and Brian denies it. Again, this is probably the most famous topic, I think, in gospel scholarship of the 1970s, and it's the idea of the Messianic Secret. And this idea in scholarship is that it's the Gospel of Mark that effectively creates the idea of Jesus as the Messiah. And it was the historical Jesus would never have, did not present himself in such a way. This is the creation of Jesus' followers. And this is a theme clearly in Brian. It's the followers that attribute various categories and abilities to Brian, just as people were arguing about the historical Jesus. The most famous presentation of this was actually turn of the 20th century by Vrede, but it was written in German but translated into English in 1971, I think. But it was certainly the kind of in vogue theory in gospel studies in the 1970s, and probably for at least another couple of decades. So there is that. And the other things, I mean, he's made into a martyr. Again, fairly common scholarly argument, forget whether it's right or wrong, that the idea that Jesus could have had sort of an accidental death, and his followers therefore attributed the status of being a martyr to him. The other obvious one, I think, is miracles. The followers say he did miracles. And what's going on constantly in this film is they're showing that Brian's a kind of ordinary, kind of ethical teacher, I mean, if anyone is treated positively in the film at any time, it's that moment when Brian starts talking about we're all individuals, starts talking about being kind to each other and all that kind of stuff. That's about the ethical core of the film. And it roughly parallels a very long tradition of what sort of liberals and certain people to the left have argued about the historical Jesus, that he was a decent ethical teacher, and all the other paraphernalia comes later. So I think Brian is a kind of, Brian is sort of the historical figure of Jesus according to the film, whereas the actual Jesus in the film is the traditional Christ of faith, slightly kitschy, romantic, quite distant, and they're not that interested in that figure. The final thing I want to say about this is something on the nature of satire, though. I mean, it was a very provocative film in its time, did cause a lot of controversy, but when it was brought out on TV and things, I mean, I remember when it came out, I think it was 91 or something like this, yeah, 1991 on Channel 4, and most people found it funny, but it didn't really cause any widespread scandal or anything like this. I remember watching it and I just didn't pick up on anything remotely blasphemous. Not that I was particularly lucky, but it just didn't really cross my mind. And I think there's something to be said about the nature of satire here. I mean, sometimes satire, and we see this a lot right now, I think, satire can be not conservative, but certainly something that upholds the status quo, an emerging status quo in the case of Life of Brian. I think Life of Brian gave cultural credibility to a number of ideas that were starting to emerge and crystallize around Thatcherism, quite ironically, because most of them are sort of either sort of Lib Dem or Labour to the left or something like this. But the ideas of you're all individuals, these was quite crucial to the emergence of Thatcherism, that kind of idea of individualism. Notice also one of the prime targets in the film of satire is actually these kind of trade union-like figures, slightly revolutionary figures, slightly trade union figures in the different splinter groups, and they're kind of parodied throughout. So I think unintentionally, what you get with this film is buying into emerging Thatcherism, and then you get a lot of this with subcultural traditions and subcultural satire, that it buys into what's emerging. It's not necessarily that confrontational as people might think. And it's interesting when you look at the film 10 years later, 11, 12 years later, it's really, what's controversial about this film? And the other factor is, I mean, is what's controversial about it in religious terms? Well, if you believe in critical biblical scholarship as being something worthwhile and all this kind of thing, is that blasphemous? I think even today, a number of conservative Christians would find that line difficult to uphold. So I think there's a number of issues that come out of this film. One is it's presenting some fairly conventional ideas about reconstruction of the historical Jesus, certainly some with a bit of an edge as well, but also that it's satire playing into ideas of status quo and things like this, or an emerging status quo. I think I should finally end with one point. There is one thing that didn't make the film, and it was the character the suicide squad at the end. There's a guy called Otto who's in the original one, and he was a kind of Zionist figure, talking about 1,000-year rule and all this kind of thing. And I think it was the Star of David turns into the Nazi symbol to kind of as a comment. They cut that out, and I think the interesting thing about this was, and I think it comes up with other ideas of satire, is Eric Idle in particular had Jewish friends. They have Jewish friends, and when you can talk about this among your in-group, it's one thing, and I don't think they kind of realized how shocking that would be. So they had limits on themselves, that when they didn't want to push certain things too hard. And that's why I think they were even slightly self-conscious that there was a relatively, I don't know if this is the right word, tame view of attacking religion in this. They don't actually go that hard on Christianity in the end. They still try to put this as a reasonable, sensible, academic, critical view. I reckon I've gone on too long there, Alissa, so you better cut me off.
That was really great. Thank you, Brian. Brian. Thank you, Professor.
Jesus, Brian.
I'm thinking about everything you said. To all our participants, please start typing your questions. I think we heard a lot of rich ideas right now. I learned a lot. So If you do have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box and I will read them out. And I want to maybe ask about one of the last points that you started bringing in. So I think there is a lot of censorship when creating religious satire. I feel like creators, directors, whatever they are, they're really, they know what they're walking into, right? They can see how the public is going to maybe perceive some of their art and react towards it. And sometimes they avoid insulting the religious groups. And my question is, first of all, do you think, you already touched on it a little bit, but to what extent were they trying to censor themselves? Not only in the final scene, which was dropped, but do you think also when they were discussing the historical Jesus versus the real Jesus, were they censoring themselves? Were there any stops in your opinion? And also I think this is a question that doesn't only touch on Life of Brian, but in general, more, I think to a larger extent, should satire try and avoid insulting religious groups? Is that something that satire should be doing? So that would be just interesting for me to hear.
Yeah, I can't think of any examples of them self-censoring as such. I mean, they did say that, I mean, I think it was Graham Chapman, he said they didn't want to take the piss out of Jesus because they thought he was actually quite a nice guy. And I think that's quite important for the film because, I mean, even if they think what they're doing with Brian is Jesus, he's still about as close as you get to a positive character in the film. There's, I don't know if you call that self-censoring. I think that's a kind of unconscious cultural censoring, if you like. There's a really strong inherited tradition that Jesus is basically nice, even if you don't believe all the miracles and resurrection and all that kind of stuff. So they're in that kind of tradition, consciously or not. I don't think there's anything explicit I can recall that they did to self-censor on that front. Second question is a bit more difficult. Should groups avoid doing it? It just depends. I mean, I think you've got to be quite tactical about these things. I mean, like, to me, this starts to get into some kind of personal issues where I try to keep these things sort of kind of critical and academic and distant. I try to analyze things rather than make a judgment on whether these things are right. But if you were to ask me, I think I'm probably of the opinion that anything should still go, but shouldn't push me too hard on this because I won't be able to give you a good answer. But there needs to be some kind of self-restraint amongst people about when to really go for it and all this kind of thing, some kind of measured judgments and things. But I'm quite reluctant to say that to start banning things or imposing censorship on issues of religion. Yeah, I'm actually, I might get sacked myself.
Yeah, no, that's that's great. We have a question here from Michael, who said, "Great brief presentation, James or Brian or whoever." He would like you to say more about the movie representing emerging Thatcherism. Yeah,
I've been slightly provocative there, but I think I'm essentially right. In the from the 1960s onwards. You start to get the fallout from the kind of post-war consensus where state intervention is quite a strong idea into all sorts of notions of individualism and freedom. Now, a lot of this stuff then tended to be kind of social freedoms to do with sexuality, gender, whatnot. Thatcherism was more typically economic freedoms, freedom to buy your council house, freedom to choose your hospital and that kind of thing. But I think in the 1970s, the Tories were blending those kind of ideas together in many ways, at least rhetorically. And that's the kind of way the world was, what we now know as neoliberalism was emerging at the time. Now, I think we know that the Monty Python were hardly Thatcherites in the sense that they certainly wouldn't have supported Tories and stuff like that. But these ideas of individualism that come through in this film partly explain, I think, why it's so popular. The central message, if there is a central message, it is that we are all individuals kind of thing. And one of the things that satire did from the 1960s onwards that I think often unintentionally fed into Thatcherism was its attack on old-fashioned bureaucrats. So, the Archbishop, the military leader, but also the trade union leaders, and the trade unions as being stuffy, old-fashioned, stifling, and things like this. So I think that's what I would say, how it sort of plays into emerging Thatcherism. I think a lot of it's sort of very unintentional, but that's the way ideology works.
Yeah. Great. We have another question from Jim. Can I just ask those who are watching us to type your questions into the Q&A portal rather than the chat? It's easier to control that way. So Jim asks, do you think Python was trying to be subversive and countercultural in their Life of Brian as part of their larger subversive agenda? Yeah, that's his question.
Yeah, I think it relates to the second one. I think yes, they certainly were trying to do that. I mean, that's what satirists try to do. I think sometimes satirists overestimate their ability to change, although I think it's a lot of satirists also recognise that they're not changing very much when they do it. I think, and I think a lot of historical change does, I mean, in kind of Western societies in sort of Britain, America, does come around through the cultural credibility of subcultural things. I don't think it's that countercultural in a strong sense. I mean, I think a lot of the ideas in the film, even at the time in certain circles, were fairly standard. Its reception was a little different, but I think they were trying to be kind of relatively mainstream academic type of scholars when they approach this kind of thing, with a few bits and pieces like, you know, Jesus didn't get resurrected, and mother may have been raped and things like this that are more on the not on the fringes of critical scholarship, but more provocative edges of critical scholarship, let's say. So I think they're certainly trying to do that, but that's the sort of thing that cultures latch onto when they're changing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have an anonymous question. So we talked a little bit about how the English audience received Life of Brian, or people in the UK. How do you think the Jewish community received Life of Brian? You mentioned the censorship of the last scene, but for a Jewish viewer, this isn't criticizing their religion, but it's using a lot of content from an era which is very dear to somebody who is Jewish and religious. So if you could comment on that.
To give a proper answer, it would have to be, you know, you'd have to do all sorts of surveys and things like this. I mean, it's just too diverse, I think. I mean, there were certainly Jewish, sort of the more conservative areas of Judaism. There were certainly conservative reactions amongst all the kind of Christian reactions as well. That there is evidence of that. There doesn't seem to be kind of any widespread Jewish hostility towards it. It's I mean, once you cut out the Otto scene, it's it's more playful, I guess. They've got friends. Eric Idle certainly talks about Jewish friends and talking to them about this kind of film. There is, I mean, you know, you take that clip we saw out of context and it potentially could be offensive, but it's clear, I think it's coming from a place that is broadly sympathetic at the same time. I don't think there's much evidence of widespread Jewish hostility. I mean, there is evidence of widespread Christian hostility in certain Christian circles, although that dies down really in 10 years. But you go to the kind of more traditional or conservative areas of Judaism, there were some reactions, yeah. I think, I mean, it's quite difficult to know quite what it was other than broadly attacking religion as such, because I mean, I can't think of anything offhand that's too directly negative about Judaism. Playful perhaps, but nothing too, you know, too provocative.
Yes, no, I'll now speak now as a Jewish chaplain at the University of Cambridge. I'll switch my hats, but I will say that I think, and this is a little bit like what we said about The Jews Are Coming last week, that the fact that it's centered in a Jewish scene, so any reference to sex or references to big noses and stuff like that, or the fact that they squabble so much amongst themselves, I think that could potentially, for a very Orthodox viewer, be a little bit touchy. But then again, most Orthodox viewers, when they watch content like this, they will be touchy when it's their religion. On the other hand, I think a different reaction, which we could expect, is people to be a little bit glad that it's Christianity that's being made fun of and not Judaism. Yeah. So I think that's in that, right? Yeah.
The nose issues kind of is interesting. I think there was a hint of it in that clip, but the big nose was the Roman nose, was the
right.
thing. And in the squabbling, the big nose was simply because he had a big nose, because they were all Jewish groups. So it wasn't simply, you know, the stereotype Jews have. It was this particular person has one. I think there was one reference, wasn't there, in that thing that he self-identified something with us, but they didn't really go for that kind of angle. Interest. Yeah. For whatever reason.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions coming in, so I'll read them out. So we have Robert, who is asking, do you think that Monty Python falls into the satire paradox, in which the critique a satire offers ultimately strengthens the thing it is critiquing, e.g., have I got news for you?
Yes, I think it does. And I think this one's, I think, is a little bit different in that I don't think there certainly wasn't the intention there at all to do that. That's just the way the world happened to be moving, and they ended up being part of it. Have I got news for you? And all things like Mock the Week and all that kind of thing. I think, I mean, they're quite consciously playing into some very general liberal kind of consensus views, particularly on, for instance, Europe or something like this. I think they're much more self-aware about what they're doing, and why it's starting to, some of this format is starting to look so dated and tired already, because it's Monty Python was ahead of the curve. That sort of stuff, I think, is just very standard Guardian-esque kind of yeah. I mean, what did Chris Morris call them? Something like the court jesters. I mean, satirist noting that other satirists now are just taking the role of the court jester. I think that's right.
We have a question from Elaine, I think, I hope. How would you relate this religious satire of Jesus to the Charlie Hebdo's controversy going on right now in France with Muhammad's caricatures and the beheading of a teacher?
This is an interesting comparison, for different. I mean, the situation in France. I mean, because obviously we've seen this in France and in different ways in Belgium as well, I think, but in the Danish cartoon as well. I mean, they're slightly different because they've got. I mean, the French situation is quite different to ours, I think, in the UK. I mean, there's a whole local histories with immigration and communities in and around Paris, and the history of French secularism, which is different to the history of British secularism and attitudes towards religion, which is fairly, we just don't really talk about it anymore, don't really care about it, something like this. But it's much more pointed in France. The other difference is, I think Monty Python tapped into a fairly popular notion of Jesus, the idea that he's a nice guy, whereas the examples of the Charlie Hebdo typically have been directly aimed at the leader figure himself, and not kind of, oh, he was a nice. I mean, this is a bad guy, very negative image and all that kind of thing. So there's so this is why I don't think Monty Python is necessarily quite as provocative. I mean, I'm trying to use that in a, how do you use phrases like neutral in a context like this, but you see what I mean, a kind of distance. And the comparison in this country, the other comparison in this country might be something like Four Lions, which was looking at Muslim communities, but quite popular as far as I can see, and there's certain examples amongst Muslims. And one of the reasons so people say, why wasn't this controversial? Well, I think one of the reasons why it wasn't controversial is because it doesn't attack the founder figure. Now, if Life of Brian had did a full-scale attack on Jesus, that he's a bad guy, I don't think we'd necessarily get something like the Charlie Hebdo reaction, but I think that then the film would have been remembered as a lot more. Now it would be much more difficult for them to defend it, I think, rightly or wrongly, because it doesn't attack the founder figure that strong. Some people might think that, but clearly from its own kind of logic, it's not attacking that figure. I mean, in fact, Jesus himself comes out completely orthodox.
Right. I think I'll just add, this is a question that came up also last week with regards to the Jews are coming. And I'll just add that in Islam, there is obviously a prohibition about even making a picture of the prophet, right? They don't, if we walk into a mosque, there are arabesques, right? That's how they decorate the interior of a mosque. And so I think just the picture, even if you're not ridiculing, that's already blasphemous. That's already a form of blasphemy for Islam. And so I think it has to do with how the religion views just its own rules, right? What are the rules of the religion? Also in Judaism, there are rules about how we, the prophet and how you discuss him, but they're very lax and they're very open versus Islam. And so I think the reaction is also particular to which religion is being used as, I think, as the exhibition.
Yeah, I think that's true.
Okay, so we have another question. What can you say about the closing scene?
The crucifixion in the song?
Yes. Always look at the
always look at the bright side of life. Again, I would take this is a very important part of the film. It's the ending of the film. You know, I mean, they're joking around, obviously. But look at what happens here. The life of Brian follows the gospel narrative, broadly speaking. It starts with the birth in Bethlehem, the star and all that. Where does it end? Not with the resurrection. It ends with death. It ends with the crucifixion. And I think that's important because they don't want Brian to be resurrected because they don't believe in that kind of stuff. And it's not only that, it's quite emphatic. It's always look on the bright side of life, and then it says very clearly in the song that that's it, death's the final word. So enjoy life. Pretty much the central message of the film in many ways. But it's interesting that it's very emphatic that death is it, and that's that, no resurrection. So I think it's part of their kind of critique of the gospel tradition in much the same way. So I think it's a very important part of the film, actually, the song at the end, as silly and all that as it is. And doubly important because Man United won the European Cup Winners' Cup in 1991 when the film came out on Channel 4, and this was sung all around the ground in Holland. So it has particularly happy memories for me.
Yeah. So Lena is asking, forgive the overall general question, which may be very hard to answer in this context, but if some self-restraint of satire about religion may be necessary, then under what conditions or with consideration is it to be practiced? How does fear play in self-censorship? Thank you.
It's a really difficult question. That's the question I said I couldn't really answer. I mean, I think it's completely wrong that anyone should, in my view, that anyone should be punished for blasphemous, anything to do with blasphemy, or the fact that we've got a history of this and people who have fought against it and people who have died for it is simply, in one sense, crazy to me. But do you want to? The question then becomes: who do you target in some way? Do you target minority communities? And I don't want to let some communities off simply because they're minorities either. I mean, I think you should be treated as grown-ups, whatever. But there are issues of social cohesion. There are issues of do you want to start targeting certain communities because they're deemed to be this, that, and the other. It's a really difficult question. I'm sorry, I really don't have a good answer to it because I mean, it's something I have thought about, but I don't really know how to square the circle in a way between not wanting to be offensive and allowing and making sure that we can critique anything in front of us. I guess I don't think it just applies to religion, but it's a really difficult question for me to answer. Others may have well, anything's a better answer to that, I'm afraid, but others may have decent answers to that. I haven't got one, unfortunately.
Yeah. I think as many things, it depends on context. So who are you making the satire, the ridicule of, and then which society are we part of, which religion? I think all of these different elements interplay into what then is okay to laugh at and whatnot. And that's why it's so hard to give a general answer, right? Because we need the specifics to discuss each case. I
mean, it's just like me saying, I mean, the issue of Judaism is a difficult one because of obviously it's religion versus ethnicity and all that kind of thing. You know, I mean, if someone starts making Jewish jokes, it just kind of horrify me in a way. And then you get to the question, what do we do about that legally and things like this? And it's really complex issue in if you see what I mean. I don't know the answer to that. I think you're absolutely right. It's context specific and you've got to make these kind of judgments, but who tells you to make the judgments and what consequences are there is where it gets difficult, I think.
Right. There's another question from Michael. So he says there was an academic conference on Life of Brian where John Cleese spoke, and he wonders if you participated in that conference and what did you take away from what was said?
I was at that conference. And
maybe you can tell us a little bit about the conversation.
Yeah, there was a 2012, 13, something like that, 14 maybe, something like that. And it was organised by Joan Taylor, King's College London. And there was John Cleese attended, as did Terry Jones, who was not looking, I mean, he died recently, but he was not looking particularly well at the time. And one of the people involved in the filmmaking, who was particularly interested in questions of historical Jesus and things like this. So it got scholars from, you know, all around the world, people who worked on historical Jesus, people like Bart Ehrman, Paula Fredrickson, Imogen Levine. And it got people who worked on things like film and reception history of the Bible. And so it brought all these kind of people together to have a day, I'm forgetting all the details, day or two symposium on life of Brian and its relevance. Now, I think they were very pleased it was treated seriously as a serious piece of, something worth analysing in detail. Philip Davis once said something about this. It's entirely fitting that we treat comedy like this in a serious manner. And it was quite an interesting collection. It was a kind of mixture of nostalgia and critique in many ways. And one of the fun things for me is watching. You would have seen some of the most famous scholars in the world crawl over their dying mother to meet John Cleese at this time. It was a sight to behold. And there was a discussion with them and things like that. And there was some interesting moments that came out, I think, for me. One was there was a degree of puzzlement that this was so popular to be amongst academics. And one of them is that how far behind the times they were. I mean, it was kind of funny. I think John Cleese was really critical of the Pharisees, and John Taylor said, well, these days, there's a lot of work being done on the Pharisees, and he was like, what? The Pharisees, maybe they were just kind of ordinary religious figures of the day, and perhaps the polemics against them had been overblown and things like this. He was quite surprised at that, interestingly. So the other guys, there was another person involved in the making of the film who was very interested in the details of critical gospel scholarship. And there were some people who were a bit mildly critical of the film. I did call them Thatcherites. I don't know how they took it, but he's rich enough to be able to cope. I'm sure he'll live without after that critique. So it became a book edited by Joan a couple of years ago. Well worth reading. Really interesting conference. Really, there's a link I think put in the. It was kind of really interesting moment in religion and biblical studies, I think, to see that kind of engagement between scholarship and the people involved in the film. Yeah,
I think we're getting to the close of our webinar, so this is the last question. I think it's a great question to end with. Can you discuss the question of patronage for this film? Did George Harrison's support of the movie contribute to its acceptance?
It seems that way. I mean, it was becoming a problem, and in the 11th hour. George Harrison steps in, and it's all the story of handmade films and all that emerges from it. It does seem, as far as I'm aware, that George Harrison's financial contribution was fairly important in getting this film going, and he gets a nod in. I think it's in the film. It's certainly in the script. I think it's in the film where he gets a cameo, and it talks about the mound being reserved for this character and all this. So there's a little nod to him in it, and from this, I think. I mean, he was in some ways connected to that circle as well, but I think it was quite important. It's quite interesting. It's independent film again. I think this is quite a significant moment that there's different ways away from the kind of old established ways of doing these kinds of things. And in the early days of Thatcherism, this kind of filmmaking, entrepreneurship and so on was lauded. Gets swallowed up, I think, into bigger monopolies as time goes by, but that was part of, I think it's still part of the same kind of discourse. So I think it was an important moment getting George Harrison involved.
Yeah, and that goes back to a different thing we discussed earlier, which is what's the context of the film to produce satire which is acceptable, right? That's another thing that goes into that conversation.
Absolutely.
Okay, so if everybody could join me in a virtual applause. This was really interesting, and I think it raised a lot of really great points. And for me, it's also interesting to see how the conversations which we started 2 weeks ago are continued into the episode today. And I want to invite all of you viewers for our next episode, which is taking place in 2 weeks exactly at the same time, where we will be discussing The Righteous Gemstones, which is a Netflix, well, it was produced by HBO and also is aired on Netflix. And that is taking place in an evangelical Christian scene. It's an American series. I think it's going to be very, very interesting. There, they hardly interact with the religious content, and they just use it as a place to have this series. And it's a question, why don't they make fun or laugh with the Christian content that's presented by evangelical Christians? So that's going to be in 2 weeks. So please join me, and the link will be sent to your emails. But again, thank you so much to all our viewers. Thank you to our viewers on Facebook. And thank you, James, so much for participating today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great. Have a good night. Thank you.
You too.